While the last video covered an exhaustive list of generally applicable damage rotations, some boss encounters in Destiny 2 provide unique circumstances that result in the development of environment-specific strategies. For example, some bosses have hitboxes or behavior that decreases or nullifies the effectiveness of certain abilities or weapons. This might sound familiar. If you watch part 1 of this series, we'll be applying the considerations we discussed there to every Destiny 2 raid and dungeon boss in this video. From oldest to newest, we're going to approach every boss using the formula I've been alluding to throughout this entire series. Step 1. Take a boss's environmental factors and considerations into account. Step 2. Understand how those factors might affect what you choose to use for damage. Step 3. Figure out how to actually execute the strategy you have planned. However, there's one more thing this video will also go over since I think it's an important consideration. Most people who do encounters in a raid or dungeon aren't doing them in isolation. There are other factors that go into what you are doing before and after said encounter, which will change what you choose to use during damage. Specifically, I'm going to use my experience as a speedrunner to explain how encounter-specific damage loadouts might change in the most restrictive and loadout-sensitive style of play, optimizing for speed. In a speedrun, you may be restricted to certain class compositions or subclasses in order to speed up the mechanics portion of the activity. You may be limited on ammo. In fact, you may even have teammates that cannot participate in damage because of a role they are performing elsewhere in the activity. While this may not apply to everyone, I think this information will still serve a valuable informational purpose in explaining how damage loadouts are chosen when considering the bigger picture. Throughout this video, you'll start to pick up on a couple of trends. First, buff and debuff options are almost always chosen with minimizing damage loss in mind. What does that mean? When optimal setups can, they try to avoid using Well and opt for Radiant and Lumina instead, since Well means one less damage super in the fire team. Debuffs are prioritized in the following order for the same reason. Felwinners, which cost nothing but a finisher, Tractor, which costs a rocket slot on the team, Tether, which costs a better damage super, then any form of Weaken, which loses out on the full 30% debuff. As for main damage, for short phases, burst options like Parasite and Grand Overture are used, while for medium or longer phases, it's almost always some sort of rocket rotation with special weapons customized to the encounter environment. Keep this in mind and it will help you determine the best damage strategies for any encounter you're faced with in the future. Today we're going to be talking about the two major activities where boss DPS is front and center, raids and dungeons. Let's start with raids. Part 6. Optimal boss kills. Raid boss DPS is a little different from dungeon DPS for two major reasons, player count and mechanical complexity. Regarding the former, raid DPS is more forgiving to optimize, since more players means a higher percentage of the fire team can focus on purely doing damage rather than debuffing or being on galley. Regarding the latter, often certain players may modify their loadouts or take a less involved role in damage in order to better meet the requirements of an encounter mechanic, something that is almost never seen during dungeon damage phases. With that out of the way, let's start by throwing it back to Forsaken, beginning with Last Wish. The oldest currently playable raid in Destiny 2, Last Wish has two universal properties that apply to every damage environment in the activity. First, Last Wish is located in the Dreaming City, meaning that Transcendent Blessing and Riven's Curse mods have active effects in the raid. In order to get the highest increase from these mods, players will use what is called a 3-2 split, using 3 of one mod and 2 of the other. This is due to the fact that the mods stack additively with themselves, but multiplicatively with the other type of mod. If you have 5 blessings, your damage bonus is 25%, whereas if you have a 3-2 split, your damage bonus is slightly higher at 26.5%. On top of this, all enemies in Last Wish are taken, meaning that Taken spec is the way to go instead of boss spec in this activity. Kalli. The first two bosses of Last Wish share pretty much all of their damage properties, minus mechanics. That is to say, they are Techians, so they multiply any damage to their head by 2, including impact damage from weapons like rockets. As for other factors, Kalli has a moderate amount of setup time before damage starts, a couple enemies nearby, a very close engagement range, and a trapping method where one player can apply a damage over time source to Kalli while she is deciding on a plate to teleport to in order to force her to stay at that plate while players kill her. Based on this information, there are a couple damage rules that need to be filled in order to optimally kill Kalli. First, you need a player to trap her, whether that's using Wither Horde, Anarchy, or Necrotic Grip. Second, you of course need your standard buff and debuff. Since everyone is damaging from a pretty safe and static location, Lumina or an Assembler Rift are an easy pick, with Radiant if Golden Gun is involved. Tractor is a pretty sensible choice for a debuff as well, since Double Slug is great precision damage and doesn't lose much DPS, given power weapons aren't really used much in optimal Kalli strategies anyways. As for everyone else, the best precision damage options today include Izanagi's Burden, Slug Shotguns, and Marksman Golden Gun. In a speedrun environment, not too much changes from a typical kill. One player is missing because they're on skip, and the team is typically on 2 Warlocks and 3 Hunters. As a result, one player is on Double Slug Tractor, while everyone else is on Izanagi's Burden and a Slug, since 3 Star Eater Scales boosted Golden Guns with Kinetic Surges and a 3-2 split do enough burst damage with Izanagi's Burden that double slugging isn't really a concern. Shuro Chi. In exchange for having more complex mechanics and more mini phases, Shuro Chi is much simpler to kill quickly. The only real mechanical factors to consider with this boss are the fact that 3 players are on plates to break her shield, which means they can't really set up anything for themselves right before damage, but that's not really of consequence given how little health Shuro has every break. Since it's not really sustainable to have a well for every break, players typically use Ember of Torches to make everyone radiant right before doing damage at every break. The same applies to debuffing. You can't really have a tether for every break, and it would be a waste given how short the mini phases are. As a result, Tractor is the best choice, especially because it can be used to debuff her before her shield even goes down. Damage-wise, we're looking at pretty much the same weapons as we used on Kalli, Izanagi's Burden, Slugs, and Marksman Golden Gun. Optimal damage is barely even what I could call a proper phase on this boss. For reference, with 3-2 and Kinetic Surges, a single Nighthawk Golden Gun plus a honed Izanagi shot instantly kills a single break. In a speedrun, Shuro Chi changes pretty drastically when it comes to mechanics, but damage-wise, not much is far from what you'd expect. Since damage is very easy to optimize, teams opt to have one player on Gjallarhorn to clear adds more quickly, so 2 people are on Slugs instead of 1, which would otherwise only include the Tractor player. Besides that, the Warlocks will often be doing puzzle plates or skipping to the next floor early, so the Hunters will be left to do damage by staggering their Golden Gun casts across multiple breaks and using Izanagi's Burden from a distance. Morgeth. Morgeth is famous for having very little health, and much like Shuro in an optimized setting, his health bar disappears in a flash. Unlike the Techians, Morgeth and Riven actually have a reduced crit scaler, meaning that options that do high body damage are preferred over weapons like slugs and snipers. Mechanics-wise, Morgeth doesn't have too much to consider besides starting damage next to the last strength. In fact, Morgeth is one of the most forgiving raid bosses in many regards, with an extremely long setup time, many adds at a variety of distances, and a relatively safe and close engagement range. When it comes to general team structure for Morgeth damage, almost any buff will do, with Well and Radiant being popular options. As for the debuff, since he dies so quickly, Tractor Cannon is preferred in order to debuff the boss before he becomes damageable, since Tether wastes a potential Blade Barrage slot. In terms of weapons, players typically use Grand Overture or Parasite depending on the setup and circumstances. In Last Wish speedruns, Morgeth is actually done as a trio, since the 3 Warlocks begin the encounter by skipping to Vault and starting it immediately after Morgeth dies. As a result, damage is a bit tighter, but the kill is still almost instant. By shooting Parasite into the sky early and having one person swap the Tractor, the Hunter team can get 3 debuff Blade Barrages off on top of 3 max Worm's Hunger Parasites. Riven. Riven is a rather unique boss in terms of damage model. First, like Morgeth, she takes 60% of the normal damage you would do to a crit if you shoot her mouth. On top of that, her mouth appears to visually take twice the damage of her body, even if both do the same actual damage to her health bar. To put it simply, Riven has twice the numerical visual health if you shoot her mouth compared to her body. Otherwise, with a moderate setup time, plentiful enemy availability, and a close engagement range, Riven is fairly forgiving to set up damage on. The Ahamkara model also has another quirk that makes the specific weapon very potent on this boss since Lightfall's release. Bouncing projectiles can embed themselves in the folds of Riven's body, hitting much more than they would against a normal target on the ground. Up until Witch Queen, we only had special waveframes, but with the release of Lightfall, Dimensional Hypotrachoid, a heavy ammo waveframe with a multi-shot magazine, was given to us as a gift for Riven DPS. By dumping a mag of this weapon into the wall above Riven's arm and then blade barraging her cheek, Riven can be killed pretty much instantly. Buff and debuff wise, nothing special here, just Radiant and Tractor for the same reasons as Morgeth. As for Final Stand, switching to Izanagi's Burden and having everyone but the Tractor shoot a honed shot is an instant way to kill Riven as soon as she becomes damageable. Speedrunners don't really deviate from the strategy I just mentioned, except for the fact that you have one Warlock sending Riven early from the other side of damage, and the fact that you have 2 Warlocks and 3 Hunters doing damage. However, even given these restrictions, the Riven kill is still pretty much instant. As for the Warlocks, one is on Well to hit a bounce in the Ascendant Plane to pick up the strength quickly, and the other is on Cataclysm Nova, which is used the same way Blade Barrage is for damage. Garden of Salvation. Shadowkeep's featured raid doesn't have any destination-specific mods like blessings or curses, but it does have activity-specific mods that affect damage in the form of relay defenders. With each enhanced copy providing an additive 10% to any damage near a relay, players can stack up to a 50% damage boost in certain damage scenarios in the raid. Consecrated Mind. Big Harpy number 1 has a couple things in store for players trying to come up with optimal damage strategies. First, your weapons need to be suitable for breaking the 12 eyes the boss presents in order to start damage. Second, the boss rapidly retreats into the center of the encounter as soon as damage starts, and if you don't follow closely enough, a wall will close off your line of sight with the boss. Third, the overloaded relay actually lingers for a small amount of time before damage starts, so it can be used to get off some relay defender boosted damage right at the start of the phase. Finally, Consecrated is quite scared of projectiles for whatever reason, so any attempt to use weapons like Gjallarhorn or abilities like Blade Barrage will result in the boss moving extremely erratically, which can be a big problem for those that aren't expecting it. Since this boss starts close and moves further away, on top of having relatively high health eyes to shoot compared to a boss like Achilles, the recommended loadout for this encounter is Izanagi's Burden, a rapid-fire sniper, and a rocket, with one player on Tractor Double Slug. Additionally, damage supers like Marksman Golden Gun and Curious Thunder Crash are the best options for high burst damage against this boss, since they don't cause him to freak out the way Needlestorm or Blade Barrage would. After breaking the boss's eyes with snipers and applying Radiant using a Torch's melee, all players need to do is a basic Izzy Sniper Rocket rotation, ensuring that Radiant is refreshed somewhere during the middle of the damage phase in order to keep a buff up the entire time. Much like Morgeth, this boss is also done in a trio in speedruns, since Garden has a unique strategy where both the third and fourth encounter can be completed at the same time. Typically, the Harpy team will be a 1-1-1 split between all 3 classes or 3 hunters, depending on the specific team's strategy. Regardless, not much changes in a trio compared to a full fire team consecrated kill, besides the fact that using relay defender mods is futile in a trio since the eyes won't break fast enough, so ghost relay damage is out of the question. Sanctified Mind. The final boss of Garden has a couple unique mechanics worth mentioning that affect how you might plan a damage strategy. First, the boss can't be damaged effectively by a lot of standard damage supers, including Blade Barrage, Needlestorm, and Thunder Crash. Second, Sanctified is easily the longest range boss in the game, especially if players opt to use a single tether, which is what is most effective DPS-wise. As a result, the obvious buff and debuff to use during Sanctified are Well and Lumina on top of Tether. Since you have a lot of time to get noble rounds before damage starts, on top of the fact that Izanagi's Burden isn't hugely beneficial for Sanctified damage, Lumina is an easy pick to squeeze out an additional 10% damage over Well. Additionally, since a player on Tractor would be relegated to Sniper DPS or using shotguns away from the relay, Tether is a much better choice for damaging this boss. Besides that, the idea is pretty simple. One Gjallarhorn, single Tether, everyone else rocket spams by the opposite relay from the tethered one. At the same time as Harpy, Sanctified is also being killed in a trio in speedruns. In a trio, damage is a lot tighter than a fireteam kill, but it's still relatively easy to pull off with the right strategy. There's a couple things speedrunners do in order to ensure that the kill goes down smoothly. First, the boss tether is done with 2 people, so that one person can focus on maximizing damage. Additionally, Pack Hunter is applied early, so everyone has Wolfpack rounds on their very first rockets. Finally, an Echo of Undermining Grenade is thrown by the Tether Hunter early in order to ensure that the boss is debuffed as soon as damage starts. Deepstone Crypt. While DSC doesn't have any particular mods that affect damage, it does contain 2 unique encounters that are damaged in a way that is yet to be replicated by another boss in Destiny 2. Crypt Security. On top of not taking precision damage, Crypt Security has a number of interesting quirks where certain buffs and debuffs do not function correctly because of its proxy design. As a result of fuse health being tied to a vandal located underneath the map, some interactions with stacking do not function correctly, with the same applied to Atraks, which has a similar design. Additionally, scaling-wise, certain weapons drastically overperform compared to how they usually fare on bosses, probably because the fuse damage modifiers are not the ones most bosses use. There are a number of weapons that are often recommended by content creators for this encounter, but I'd like to narrow it down to a select 3. First, Bastion can destroy a fuse in 2 shots with any applicable damage buff, including Well, Bubble, or Lumina. While it's not necessarily the fastest option, it is definitely the easiest and simplest option to use that will yield the greatest proportional results. Second, the 4th Horseman is also a good option in coordinated teams, since it can break fuses faster than Bastion with some help, but requires greater reliance on teammates. Finally, the Wardcliff Coil is another choice that can destroy a fuse in a single rocket, but it's a little picky with its range and a little risky with its blast. When it comes to debuffs, something in a patch in the last year was discovered to have changed the way fuses work in order to allow for debuffing, but it doesn't really make sense to have someone dedicated to debuffing when the fuses can be one-shot with the correct strategy anyways. In DSC speeds, the actual fuse damage is handled by only 3 players. As for the others, one is scanning out of bounds, one is downstairs doing operator, and one is setting up for an early transition to Atraks by sparrow breaching through a wall on dark side. That being said, it's still possible to instantly break fuses as a group of 3 people. On dark side, a player on Rain of Fire and Wardcliff solos. On light side, 2 players on the 4th Horseman duo and shoot fuses together in order to break them instantly. Atraks. Atraks probably has the shortest damage phase in the entire game and will likely retain that title for the rest of Destiny 2 history. After breaking past her damage threshold, Atraks disappears almost instantly, leaving a very short window to do damage to her before she changes floors. While she does appear to have an increased precision multiplier, don't be fooled. Precision weapons appear to do reduced true health bar damage to Atraks, and in terms of actual results, there have yet to be any promising kills involving abilities like Marksman Golden Gun and weapons like Izanagi's Burden. Like I mentioned earlier, Atraks has a proxy captain that acts as her health bar since she has 8 clones distributed throughout the encounter that need to share this data. Much like Crypt Security, certain weapons and abilities overperform in this encounter compared to other more typical raid bosses. While options like Blade Barrage and Needlestorm are typically the top pick on most raid bosses, issues with hit registration on Atraks make supers like Curious Thunder Crash and Cataclysm Nova Bomb a better choice. While weapons like Apex Predator and Cold Comfort typically enjoy the spotlight in other raid damage scenarios, Atraks has such a short phase that these weapons don't really make a lot of sense against her brief damage window. While Atraks can be debuffed with Echo of Undermining or other void weakened sources, it's typically easiest to just have a bunch of Thundercrash Titans super her at the same time, followed by dumping a Horseman mag into her as she attempts to teleport away. In an optimized speedrun, Atraks is done with 4 people in the encounter, with one of those players unable to make it to the top floor to do damage in time. The other 2 players are skipping to descent and hitting a checkpoint between 2nd and 3rd encounter respectively, so the damage phase itself is actually handled by 3 people. Those 3 players are typically Titans, and all of them cast Curious Thunder Crash as soon as the scanner call is made, and then the 4th Horseman is used as mentioned above. As for Final Stand, it's typically handled by the bottom player, who makes their way up and uses a super like Blade Barrage to finish the job. Taniks. The final Crypt boss is actually pretty normal compared to Security and Atraks. No weird proxy stuff, so he can be buffed and debuffed and stacked against normally, and there's nothing too out of the ordinary when it comes to the other environmental factors as well. Besides having a crit that is relatively high and far away from where a typical crit would be given the distance you can do damage from, Taniks is a pretty unremarkable boss. Because of Taniks' relatively long setup time, noble rounds are very easy to get before damage, so Lumina is a good idea on top of Radiant and Well. For your debuff, Double Pellet Tractor is probably your best bet, since the boss's crit is relatively far away. As for the other players, Double Pellet Rocket is typically the go-to play for Taniks damage. Since we're using shotguns, a Lunafaction Well or Rift is also a good idea to ensure that you're hitting max shotgun damage from any place in Taniks' field. Super-wise, Blade Barrage, Needlestorm, and Thunder Crash are all viable options here since the boss is a huge hitbox and doesn't have any hit reg issues. However, when it comes to speedrunning, Taniks does have an additional environmental factor that needs to be kept track of. If you kill all the enemies in the encounter after dunking cores, Taniks instantly teleports to the middle of the encounter and starts damage without pushing people out, meaning that a lot of players in a speedrun are going to be in a hurry to start damage, often without any time for major setup. While this may seem problematic, it also creates an opportunity for the Suppressor, typically a Warlock, to use Felwinter's Helm to finish a Dark Council Guard mini-boss to debuff Taniks instead of losing a Rocket player to Tractor. Everything else pretty much stays the same, except a couple players don't get to rally or start on swords, so their damage is a little reduced compared to a typical team's run. Vault of Glass. Vogue doesn't really have any activity-specific mods that are useful for damage either, but Atheon does have a unique modifier that significantly impacts how players choose to do damage optimally. Templar. Our favorite oversized Hydra is pretty unremarkable when it comes to damage, being a pretty flexible boss encounter besides the fact that someone needs to use the relic to break his shield. You may have considered the fact that a relic holder might be a significant change in a damage strategy, but Templar dies so quickly in an optimized team that the relic can be safely dropped and ignored before it becomes an issue. Outside of very fast teams, however, this may not be the case, so it is still recommended to have a relic player block teleports and focus on using something like Tractor Cannon to keep the boss debuffed instead of committing to damage. Templar is probably the highest health boss that can still be baked with extreme burst options, including weapons like Parasite and Grand Overture. However, in a reasonable scenario, it makes more sense to use options like Double Slug or Izzy Slug Rocket on top of pretty much any typically viable damage super. Templar is a bit of a toss-up like I mentioned. Tractor makes more sense in more cautious teams that have a relic holder, while pre-tethering the ground underneath Templar's spawn is typical for more optimized teams. Additionally, since the preceding encounter, Oracles, has a ton of adds as well as a ton of downtime, a Lumina user could easily bring Noble Rounds into Templar damage on top of an existing well. The speedrun strategy for Templar is actually a little subject to change at the moment. In previous seasons, a skip was theorized that would require Templar to die in about 4 seconds, but that was not deemed to be possible at the time because of damage limitations. Shoot. This is it.
Nope.
Nope. However, with Season of the Deep, we now have the highest burst weapon damage this game has ever seen in the form of Ballador's boosted bait and switch Cold Comfort, which can be set up during the end of Oracles in order to bake Templar as fast as possible. While this has not currently been tested, if it were to work, the strategy would most likely be shooting Parasite into the sky ahead of time, much like with Morgeth, and having 4 hunters use Blade Barrage and Cold Comfort with a Shadebinder Warlock providing the Ballador's buff before damage and shooting Gjallarhorn in an Assembler Rift during damage. If this doesn't end up working, the strategy currently used involves 3 people on skip and 3 people doing damage, with a relic holder on Tractor and Gathering Storm, a Well Warlock, and a Blade Barrage Hunter on Double Slug Gjallarhorn and Double Slug Apex respectively. Atheon. Atheon is probably the most forgiving boss encounter in Destiny 2 setup-wise. Before damage, he sits frozen for almost a minute while easily accessible, infinitely refreshing enemies trickle into the encounter. While pretty much no other encounter allows for a team to sustain death throw stacks for 5 Verity's Brow Warlocks, Atheon has so many enemies present in such a relaxed environment that the strategy for optimal damage is one that requires 25 plus collective kills leading up to damage. Why Verity's Brow? Atheon's Time's Vengeance buff not only provides insane ability regeneration, but also boosts grenade damage by 3 times compared to typical raid bosses. This means that a debuffed Verity's Brow fusion grenade does over 700,000 damage to Atheon, which means that a mere 13 fusion grenades across the entire fire team kills him, not including weapon damage. In terms of setup, players should delegate who is taking what group of adds, so everyone can keep up stacks going into damage. Since the vast majority of the damage is going to be coming from the grenades, weapons like Izanagi's Burden and the 4th Horseman become irrelevant, as the only weapons that are needed are extremely high damage spammable weapons that can be fired between grenade throws, aka rockets. As such, Ariana's Vow is a huge boon for players that are not on Gjallarhorn or Tractor, as it is an extremely ammo efficient and easy way to get and maintain stacks leading up to and during damage. In VoG speedruns, one person stays behind inside the portal to solo the last wave of oracles, while everyone else leaves after the second wave in order to prepare for damage early. When the second last oracle is shot, everyone outside throws a grenade at Atheon, and by the time they explode, Atheon should be damageable. The only other noteworthy change is having the final warlock in the portal on Needlestorm to provide a tiny bit of extra burst damage when they exit the portal after finishing oracles. Val the Disciple. In recent years, Bungie seems to have strayed away from making hugely impactful raid mods. Until Val's release, it seemed that the days of mods like Enhanced Relay Defender and Transcendent Blessing were long over. That all changed when the Witch Queen raid was released. While many of the mods from this raid are relatively normal, one stands out above them all, a single energy cost mod called Into the Light. While mods in Wish and Garden boost damage by 25 to 50%, this mod goes far above and beyond any amount we ever expected a raid mod to produce. While you have no pervading darkness, so pretty much during every damage period besides Rhulk's final stand, your grenades do not 25, not 50, but 125% more damage on top of having 200% additional regen at 4 copies. This is effectively multiplying typical grenade DPS by 6.75 times, which is such a drastic change that it completely reworked Val's optimal damage strategies when it was discovered. It is highly unlikely that Bungie will ever make a raid mod as potent as Into the Light again, but if it ever happens again, there is no doubt it will shape the damage meta for said raid in the same way this mod has shaped Val, especially this next boss. Caretaker. While Caretaker does have a deceptively high amount of health, this is offset by the Ruinous Resonance plate buff, which provides players with a 2.33 times multiplier to their damage compared to a normal raid boss. Effectively, Caretaker actually doesn't have that much health to burn through. When it comes to optimal damage on Caretaker, the end goal is one flooring, that is to say, burning through his entire pre-final health bar during the 5 seconds you have after passing his floor threshold. At the time of recording this video, a consistent one-floor method hasn't been rediscovered, but I'll still describe the factors that go into what made and could make a one-floor possible. A couple things to boot. Caretaker has many adds that are relatively easy to access, adds that don't despawn once damage starts, which makes Verity's Brow viable. Setup-wise, once the ritual is complete, players have 15 seconds of downtime to do whatever setup they want before damage starts. Finally, Caretaker also ejects missiles out of his back on a regular basis, which need to be destroyed before and during damage in order to avoid getting stacks of Pervading Darkness, which cuts into the light damage. Optimal Caretaker damage involves exploiting the period before damage to stack up damage over time sources like Pulse or Storm Grenades underneath the boss, and then dumping burst weapons like Grand Overture, Parasite, or Rockets when your tick damage crosses the floor threshold, culminating in insanely high DPS coming from both sources combined. Given that this is the tightest damage check in any raid or dungeon, both the buff and debuff options should be optimized as much as possible. Lumina on top of Well is a no-brainer, and Felwinners is a legitimate option given the presence of elite adherents in the encounter, especially given that Tractor or Tether are damage loss in an extremely damage-sensitive encounter. In previous versions of the one-floor strategy, speedrun teams used 2 Warlocks and 3 Titans in order to maximize Storm Grenade count while still keeping 2 Verity's Warlocks in the encounter to provide maximum Field of Flame uptime. After Storm Grenades and Hoil were nerfed, nowadays it makes more sense to have 3 Warlocks and 2 Titans, but this is all subject to change depending on how strategy development plays out. The best option for Caretaker may be 5 Overtures, or it may involve Parasites, or it may forego those completely and run Rockets. When a viable one floor is found for speedrunning, I'll be sure to show it off on this channel, as my team is planning on returning to WoW within the next 2 seasons. Rhulk. Rhulk is a lot lower stakes than Caretaker given that you have half a minute to kill him instead of 5 seconds. With infinitely spawning and despawning Shadow Thralls plus permanent adds from the lower part of the encounter, this fight also lends itself incredibly well to Verity's Brow usage. So much so, in fact, that much like Atheon, it is actually possible to run 5 Verity's Brow Warlocks keeping max stack uptime. Damage-wise, similar to Atheon, players typically run weapons that are more useful for keeping up stacks and breaking Rhulk's crits in a timely fashion like Retrace Path and Izanagi's Burden, since all damage will be coming from rockets and grenades. Unlike Atheon, Rhulk is a lot less docile when it comes to the damage phase. Perhaps the most aggressive boss in Destiny, Rhulk chases down any player near him and attempts to kick their teeth in. On top of this, if allowed to dash, Rhulk also creates massive Pervading Darkness beams that ruin into the light's grenade damage conditions. All of this amounts to a few things. First, in order to handle Rhulk himself so that he doesn't become problematic during damage, one player can tank him and also fill the role of debuff by using Tractor, staying within melee range, and keeping Rhulk's attention. This way, the other 5 players can focus on damage without worrying about Pervading Darkness or being smacked around. Second, teams can choose to leave the adds below alive before going up to do damage to Rhulk, which will allow them to duplicate. When the time is right, players can refresh their death throw stacks before or during damage by simply dipping out of the upper arena to briefly shoot a Scion or 2. Besides that, damage is pretty simple. Break crits, then nuke the boss with grenade and rocket spam. In a speedrunning environment, nothing really changes damage-wise when it comes to Rhulk, besides maybe more specific delegation of adds for Verity stacks. King's Fall. The second reprise raid to be brought from Destiny 1 to 2, King's Fall doesn't really have much when it comes to mods or common activity modifiers that affect damage strategies. In fact, King's Fall's bosses are actually scarily normal when it comes to damage, outside of having tons of health. With the exception of one quirk, which I'll mention when we get to Oryx, DPS is pretty standard or only affected by specific encounter mechanics. Warpriest. The raid's first boss is Warpriest, a relatively vanilla boss outside of the fact that it has by far the highest effective health in the game, over double that of any dungeon boss and overtaking second place Oryx by a comfortable 18% lead. While Warpriest does have brand claimers and Aura of the Initiate, they don't actually affect damage much besides requiring one player at a time to leave and go get a claimer, as well as forcing a centralized damage location. As a result, most players decide to do damage on the top right ledge next to Warpriest. While Warpriest's movement is almost completely random, doing damage from up there guarantees that the encounter's engagement range is at most a medium distance. Buff-wise, Lumina on top of a Lunafaction well is great, and given how long many of the phases are in this raid, it will usually make sense to use Tractor on all of the King's Fall bosses. As for setup, it makes the most sense to have the Tractor player leave for a night after debuffing, since their damage is the lowest in the fire team. Warpriest is a great boss to practice damage rotations on since he's got just the right amount of movement and unpredictability, plus a long phase that is just barely a challenge for experienced teams to kill in one brand claim. Personally, I think Double Slug Tractor, Double Slug Gallahorn, and Izzy Slug Rocket is the way to go on Warpriest when it comes to general strategy. King's Fall speedruns restrict teams to 6 Warlocks because of Tomb Ships,
but even still, the kill is very fast even without any blade barrages or radiant dance machines involved. Unfortunately, the current speedrun strategy also requires that 4 of the warlocks have a glacier grenade coming out of the encounter, meaning that none of those warlocks are able to fully utilize Broodweaver's DPS assets like Threat of Ascent. As a result, the Tractor player runs Verity's Brow and uses their grenade ability near the team after killing the Brand Knight to ensure that everyone gets their glacier by the end of damage. Golgoroth. Golgoroth is a more restrictive encounter than Warpriest mechanics-wise, but it does provide the opportunity to use Verity's Brow to a greater extent, given the sheer number of enemies that spawn during damage, in stark contrast having just come out of Warpriest. However, the team is somewhat crippled by having one player holding gaze at all times, and another player anticipating needing to take said gaze. On top of that, Golgoroth also has the Pool of Reclaimed Light mechanic, where players need to shoot down bubbles in order to do effective damage to the boss. Given how ineffective a lot of standard exotic damage options are against Golgoroth, it makes a lot of sense to run weapons like Lumina and surprisingly Bastion in this encounter. Bastion one-shots bubbles from a medium distance, meaning that a single player can take care of every bubble in the fight solo, leaving everyone else to focus on damage. When noble rounds have expired, Radiant or Well is always a good idea for a damage buff. Naturally, it also makes sense to have one of your players on Tractor since they're not doing damage anyways on Gaze. As for damage, rockets are unsurprisingly great on Golgoroth like they are on every boss right now, even if the typical swap weapons like Izanagi's Burden and Slugs do not fare very well on the Ogre. Speedrunning Golgoroth involves 5 Warlocks and 1 Titan in Season 21. The Titan is on Tractor and Thundercrash, while the Warlocks are on a 3 Verity 2 Starfire distribution, with one of the Verity's Warlocks being on Gjallarhorn and Second Gaze, since that's the role that does the second lowest damage. While it used to be possible to kill in one bubble, it was never really realistic to pull it off in a full run, so the expectation is to typically kill in 2. Compared to an LFG run, none of the Warlocks can afford to place their wells for damage, so the damage buff is limited to just Lumina and Radiant melees. Daughters. Oryx's 2 daughters are a little unique within the context of King's Fall. There are 2 bosses within a single encounter, but both of them have under half the health of every other King's Fall boss. There are a fair number of enemies that spawn during this encounter that persist during the DPS phase, so options like Verity's Brow can be used to keep the Fire Team's grenade uptime high. Well, Lumina, and Radiant can all be used in optimal strategies against the daughters, but the debuff to use isn't immediately obvious. Mobius Quiver isn't great since you likely won't get one back by the time you start damaging the second daughter in a fast team. That leaves Tractor, which might seem a bit weird against a boss that is floating above you on a platform, but it works surprisingly well, especially given that Daughter's DPS is very similar to Golgoroth, grenade rocket spam. Typically, it makes the most sense to have the Gjallarhorn and Tractor on Verity's Brow, since they won't be doing too much damage with slugs within the Daughter's engagement range. The other 4 players are free to use whatever rocket rotation they want, with my personal recommendations being Izzy's Sniper Rocket or a demo-assisted grenade rotation. This encounter is done incredibly differently in speedrunning compared to normal strategies, but it doesn't actually impact the damage strategy as much as you'd think. First of all, 4 players start the encounter on a sword, and one of those players cannot participate in damage as they die in the process of dunking on both daughters at once. As a result, speedrun teams have 3 Warlocks on swords and 2 with full heavy going into damage. However, worry not. 2 of those players can be on Gjallarhorn and Tractor, and the 3rd player needs to be on a sword to start Oryx instantly early anyways. The only other encounter change in speedruns relating to damage is the fact that, as mentioned, both daughters become damageable at once. While this does make ammo a greater issue, it doesn't really change what is used for damage, only lowering the tolerance for damage loss. Oryx. For being called the Taken King, Oryx isn't actually classified as Taken, meaning Taken spec doesn't work on him and neither do any of the Will of Light raid mods. That aside, Oryx takes a page out of Warpriest's book. His mechanics have almost zero impact on damage strategy development. The only quirk he has is being one of the only truly long-range bosses in Destiny 2, and even that can be mitigated with clever bomb placement. However, given that changing Oryx into a medium engagement range boss from a long-range boss doesn't really provide any significant benefits, even optimal teams will choose to just do damage from middle at a long range, as is the standard. Finally, Oryx also has a relatively unknown 1.1 times crit multiplier, meaning that he takes an additional 10% from precision damage like I mentioned earlier, which is probably why options like Linears and Whisper look a little better on this boss on top of his, giant unmoving crit spot. It should come as no surprise that Lumina and Well are the simple and straightforward answers to the buff requirement during Oryx damage, since you have plenty of time to get noble rounds and a single Well covers the entire damage phase. Now you might think that debuffing a boss like Oryx using Tractor isn't viable, even if it would be ideal for the task given the damage phase length. However, your worries would be misplaced. You can actually Tractor Oryx's claws and even do double pellet damage without any range drop off if you aim at the right angle. Besides that, the damage strategy on Oryx is the same as the one on Daughters, 1 Gjallarhorn on Verity's, another player on Verity's legendary rocket, and then 3 damage super players pumping using Izzy's Sniper Rocket. Speedrunning Oryx doesn't really have anything too special besides one person switching from a sword to Kalli, but that doesn't change much when it comes to damage, just less rockets from one person. Root of Nightmares. The most recent raid in Destiny as of the making of this video, Root of Nightmares has two mods that are pretty useful when it comes to damage. Nothing VOW level of course, but Focus Light and Darkness provide a 20% weapon and 25% ability damage boost respectively upon getting their corresponding buffs. Since ability damage isn't a huge component in raw damage rotations, people usually tend to opt for stacking 4 or 5 Focus Light for both boss encounters. While both bosses are a breath of fresh air after facing the extremely straightforward sandbags that the King's Fall bosses are, there also isn't anything hugely unique and specific to this raid's damage environment. Explicator. Starting with Zoark, you might find this boss reminding you of another one. 3 plates, a time threshold, and a lingering buff. Feels a lot like Caretaker, huh? While you don't lose a ton of time by not one-plating Explicator, it's still a pretty tall order and one that hasn't been filled yet. While I believe a one-plate to be possible, the amount of work it would take is likely not worth the hassle given the amount of time it saves in an optimized environment, compared to the 80 or so seconds that a second floor adds onto the Caretaker encounter. That being said, Explicator's threshold timer before he goes immune is a lot shorter than Caretaker's at around half the time. Explicator also has a specific plate order, but the plate buffs linger for a lot longer than Caretaker's do, giving teams plenty of time to do the required damage without ever worrying about refreshing their buff after initially receiving it. With the introduction of bait and switch rockets, 2-plating Explicator went from being a rare occurrence to an easy task for any optimized team running Root of Nightmares. Since you have 2 to 3 separate mini phases of damage, 1 per plate, Tractor makes sense over Tether to ensure that the boss is fully debuffed for the entire phase. Since the buff lingers for a long time as mentioned, players will opt to place a single Well of Radiance in the middle of the 3 plates in order to use only one for the entire phase, on top of Lumina providing Blessing of the Sky at the start of damage. Obviously, Gjallarhorn is a no-brainer, and everyone else can be on Reconstruction rockets and some sort of reload assist, like Rain of Fire, Reload Dodge, or Threat of Ascent, which should allow for 3 easy rockets a plate. Slap Izanagi's Burden and a Trace Rifle on to proc bait and switch, and you're pretty much golden. You don't even need damage supers to easily kill this boss in one phase, but they're certainly helpful. I wasn't kidding when I said you don't need damage supers. The current speedrun strat for Explicator actually uses 6 Warlocks on Well of Radiance, and it's still a clean and easy 2-plate every time. Right at the start of each plate, everyone procs bait, then simply shoots 2 rockets with Reconstruction, dash reloads using Rain of Fire, then shoots a 3rd rocket. That's right, 6 rockets from 5 people with no damage supers is enough to kill Explicator outright. Final Stand is pretty much the same thing, and the rest is history. Nezarec. The final raid boss we're going to talk about today is Nezarec. Besides having a suppressing slam and more vertical movement, Nezarec is like an easier version of Rhulk. In fact, you don't even need someone to bait his melee attacks. If anything, that makes things worse. By simply having everyone sit at the back of a raised platform, Nezarec changes from his usual slam-happy god of pain self to a docile tormentor that just stares at you with an occasional jump here and there. This is really great for damage. It means Nezarec is basically a normal medium-range boss with 3 small crit spots instead of 1 big one. As for general strategy, right before damage starts, everyone just needs to grab the Field of Light buff from the final buff plate, and then for 20 seconds you have a free 20% weapon boost that everyone can make use of besides the Wellcaster. While this boost isn't automatic like it is in Explicator, it's still relatively low effort for free damage. Besides that, running a Lunafaction Well with a player on Lumina is pretty standard for this encounter, with 1 Tractor, a Galley, and everyone else on damage supers with double slug rocket. Only 2 things really change when speedrunning Nezarec compared to just doing competent damage. First, Nezarec's damage phase starts in a fashion similar to Taniks, where killing every ad, well, almost every ad, in the encounter starts damage instantly. That means that some players might be late to damage or unable to get the Field of Light buff, and it also makes damage start a lot more hectic. Second, only 4 players get a flag, while the other 2 start the encounter by immediately doing nodes. While this reduces the number of needle storms by a little, it doesn't impact damage that significantly in the grand scheme of things, especially when some players can be dedicated to making Aeon finishers on the various mini-bosses that spawn during the encounter. And now, it's time for dungeons. As mentioned previously, the big difference between raid and dungeon DPS is forgiveness. In a fire team of 3, even if the boss might have less health to compensate, mistakes are more problematic and you have less players to fill the same number of roles of buff, debuff, and in many cases, Gjallarhorn. That being said, dungeons are also generally much simpler than raids, so the damage strategies involved are usually also relatively simple to explain and follow. I've left a few mini-bosses out here. If an enemy only takes a single horseman mag to kill, like the hexahedron bosses in Prophecy, there's not really a need to dedicate a section to it. Going in order of release like we did with raids, let's start with the Shattered Throne. Much like Wish, Throne is also considered within the Dreaming City location, meaning Blessing and Curse mods also provide damage bonuses here.
In the same vein, Take Inspect can also be used on both bosses to increase damage from the typical 7.77% from boss spec to 10%. Besides that, both these bosses have by far the lowest health of almost any dungeon, so expect damage strategies to be catered around extreme burst. Vorgeth. This ogre's name sounds a lot like Morgeth, and he falls over just as quickly, if not even faster. With under 500,000 health, you can instantly kill this boss with 2 of any decent damage super even without a debuff. The encounter's mechanics don't really change much, and neither does the presence of enemies. If you're not speedrunning, you can kill this boss by simply having any damage buff, everyone on horseman, maybe 1 damage super if you really want, it's that simple. If you are speedrunning, the throne team composition is one of each class, with the hunter using Mask of Avarice boosted horseman, on top of a titan casting a Curious Thunder Crash, while the warlock debuffs with divinity from afar. Dul Incaru. For a final boss, Dul Incaru's optimal damage strategy is somehow even more simple than Vorgeth's. In fact, the knights probably pose a bigger challenge than the boss itself. After obtaining 3 finite thought stacks, this boss has even less effective health than Vorgeth does, which is an insane thought for a dungeon final boss. While Dul Incaru used to have the increased precision multiplier thanks to her wizard model in previous years of Destiny, semi-recently this was changed as she now actually takes reduced precision damage for whatever reason. This isn't really a problem though, as Dul Incaru also has another quirk that didn't end up changing. She takes damage with the scaling of a miner, which means that weapons like the Wardcliff Coil have their boss damage limitations removed. That's right, with Radiant, Surges, and a 3-2 mod split, Wardcliff almost one-shots this boss with 3 finite thought stacks, and that's solo. With 2 other fireteam members, it's likely that this is the fastest boss kill in Destiny 2, and it will probably stay that way. In speedruns, damage is what you'd expect. After instantly killing the knights with a Curious Thunder Crash, 2 players dump a Wardcliff shot into the boss and she instantly keels over. Pit of Heresy. The only actual encounter boss in Pit isn't a nightmare, so Dreambane armor mods don't do anything useful when it comes to DPS in this dungeon. In fact, since there's only one boss, let's jump right in. Zulmak. While Zulmak doesn't melt in mere seconds like the throne bosses, he's still a relatively fast kill with the right setup. The only requirement for Zulmak damage is staying inside his little arena and staying alive. His slash attacks do a fair amount of damage, and so it's probably a good idea to use something like a well to avoid having to worry about dying during damage. There are also a ton of adds that surround the boss arena, which can be used to keep death throws or other similar buffs running. Since Zulmak actually has some health, it's not advisable to forego debuffing him. Tether is a slightly better choice than Tractor here, and you'll find this is the case for dungeons in general moving forward. The damage loss of using Double Slug Tractor with something like Blade Barrage instead of opting to roll the Galahorn and debuff roll into one player is rather inefficient in a setting with only 3 players. Consequently, the best general strategy for this dungeon boss is running a Star Eater Scales Mobius Quiver on Galahorn, with the other 2 players on a Double Slug Rocket Spam loadout with 1 well and another damage super. In a Pit speedrun, that 3rd player will actually be another Well Warlock, so that there can be a Verity's Brow pair spamming rockets while fueling themselves off the nearby thralls. Prophecy. In this dungeon, players traverse unknown space, fighting off Taken enemies in order to seek an audience with the 9. Keyword, Taken. Take Inspect does in fact work on the bosses in this dungeon, but the activity specifics start and end there. Phalanx Echo. Let's start with Phalanx Echo. Both Prophecy bosses are pretty standard. The only thing out of the ordinary in this encounter is the sheer number of enemies that spawn before and up to damage in very close proximity to the boss. However, since this boss has much lower health than the likes of Zulmak, it makes more sense to use burst weapons like Parasite and the 4th Horseman instead of prioritizing a more sustainable damage rotation. While speedrunners will typically use Radiant on this boss in order to preserve their well from movement during the Wasteland section following the encounter, it's generally a safe idea to use well on this boss given its penchant for melee attacks on top of the surrounding enemies. As for supers, the composition is typically 2 Warlocks and 1 Hunter, with the Hunter rallying on Parasite and Mobius Quiver, since Blade Barrage has tracking issues on Phalanx, and the Warlocks on Rain of Fire with 4th Horseman. Kell Echo. After zipping down Rainbow Road, the only boss left in Prophecy is Kell Echo. Now, Kell Echo is a proper dungeon boss with effective health up to par with bosses like Avarok, Galron, and Achilles. On top of that, Kell is among the longest range dungeon bosses, which means options like shotguns are not a good idea. In something like a solo completion, the Dark Entropy mechanic might be a consideration, but in fireteam damage, the boss dies before your stacks even get to 5 if you're doing damage optimally. As for specifics, long-range damage supers are great on this boss, and since going up to the boss to Tractor would be an obvious misplay, Mobius Quiver is right at home here. After dumping your damage supers, it's pretty straightforward from there on out. Like many other dungeon bosses with this level of health, you dump Izzy GL Rocket if it's long range, or Double Slug Rocket if it's close range. Now, since there aren't really good adds to get Verity stacks, and given how fast of a kill Kell can be, it's best to have the Gjallarhorn player be on Rain of Fire or Radiant Dance machines. Finally, since Prophecy speedruns end on a Warlock and 2 Hunters, typically there's a Rain of Fire Gjallarhorn, a Mobius Lumina rocket, and a Nighthawk Izzy rocket, with each player using an ability to fall quickly down the teleport, Well, Quickfall, and Acrobat's Dodge. Grasp of Avarice. While Grasp has no common environmental factors that might affect your loadout, there are 2 mechanics that do make damage setup a little more forgiving. First, you can rally on a super that will help you progress the encounter faster and then swap after using it, since you get a free super every 10 engrams. Second, both bosses involve a rather long period of standing still and dunking riches before the damage phase starts, which makes it a lot easier to do some minor setup before damage. Phry'zhia. Phry'zhia is a really straightforward boss: get engrams, sit at crystal, do damage. Sure, there are a lot of thralls that you could use for Verity's brow stacks, but it's more straightforward to just have everyone employ the same strategy used on Kell Echo, except with shotguns being a lot more viable in this scenario. That means 1 Gjallarhorn, 1 Mobius Quiver, and a whole lot of rocket dumping. Since the buff and debuff situation are the exact same as Kell, let's talk about what makes this encounter different from Kell in a speedrun. You might have noticed that any non-final encounter in a raid or dungeon speedrun often has a player or 2 missing, and Phry'zhia is no exception. However, the player that's on skip isn't completely gone. In fact, they can help out a bit by shooting Gjallarhorn from beneath the floor in order to give Pack Hunter to the other 2 players, a Needlestorm Warlock on Lumina, and a Mobius Quiver Hunter. Additionally, since the Hunter doesn't get a rally and starts on a sword, it's a good idea to have the Hunter run a backup damage option like Merciless or Malfeasance with a Lucky Pants swap to pad out damage after said Hunter inevitably runs out of rockets early on. Avarok. For better or for worse, Avarok is pretty much the same as Phry'zhia as far as damage goes, so let's get straight to changes in optimal speedruns rather than repeating general strategy information. In Grasp speedruns, teams arrive at Avarok on 3 Hunters, and since everyone is present for damage, you can have a Mobius Gjallarhorn player for your debuff and Pack Hunter, and 2 Nighthawk RDM swaps on Izzy Rocket and Lumina Rocket to really pump out damage. Duality. While all 3 Duality bosses are nightmares, Bungie ensured that Dreambane armor mods didn't work on Galron, the Vault bosses, or Keitel for accessibility reasons. On top of that, while the Grasp bosses were all about sitting by the crystal and doing damage while essentially sitting still, none of the Duality bosses are nearly as static. Galron. Besides being vulnerable to the unstable essence orbs that drop from his shades, Galron doesn't really have many mechanics that set him apart from other bosses damage-wise. Sure, he does like being very in your face and will often attempt to kill you by pinching you into a wall. Other than that, he's a run-of-the-mill dungeon boss. While the strategy for this boss isn't completely cut and dry like it is for a lot of other bosses, a safe pick would be running 2 Acreus and 1 double pellet tractor, with 1 well and 2 damage supers of your choice. Speedrunning has typically set the pace for the optimal damage meta behind it, and this dungeon's damage strategies had pre-nerf shield bash smeared all over them. Unfortunately, the dungeon hasn't been seriously run since, so no one's come up with a fully fleshed out replacement strategy, especially considering that a player leaves on skip, leaving 1 Hunter and 1 Warlock behind to kill Galron as a duo. If it were up to me though, I think I'd take advantage of the nearby enemies by using surrounded rapid-fire shotguns, which do almost the same DPS as Acreus without consuming a lot of heavy ammo, a valuable commodity given the lack of rallies in the rest of the run. That means the Warlock is on Tractor Double Rapid, with the Hunter on Parasite Double Rapid and Star Eater Blade Barrage to maximize damage. Vault. The Vault bosses are as far as I'll go when it comes to defining the term dungeon boss. Kahawk, Emo Nut, and Euroa each have around the same effective health as Vorgeth from the Shattered Throne, except you need to kill 3 Vorgeths. The Vorgeths are surrounded by Angry Cabal, and you've just come out of dunking a flag or being in the Nightmare Realm. Designing a damage strategy around an encounter that is largely on its face centered around movement is a little tough, but not impossible. Assuming even non-speedrunners have the 2 standard runners on swords, I think the Bellkeeper killer should be on Tractor, since they don't need extremely versatile movement. Now that Shield Bash is gone, if it were up to me to plan a speedrun damage strategy nowadays, I'd have the Hunter on Tractor and maybe a Gathering Storm farming build, one that hopefully allows them to get at least 2 supers off during the encounter. Either that or something silly like 1-2 punch Avarice on Divinity, I'm not sure. The other 2 players are on Warlock for movement purposes, and since they're already on Ariana's Vow, it's the perfect excuse for the both of them to run Verity's Brow, given the surplus of enemies near the boss during damage. Keitel. Finally, we have Keitel. While Keitel's crit multiplier varies depending on the weapon being used, even in cases where it provides a rather large increase, rockets are still the clear winners. Keitel is a wonderfully simple boss to bake. She stands perfectly still, and there are no major threats nearby during damage. The only damage requirement is that players kill 2 bell keepers and stun her by shooting a bell, which can be done with pretty much any damage loadout, so that's not really a concern. Damage-wise, we have pretty much a repeat of what happens to the grass bosses, except this time Kytl actually has a surprisingly small amount of health compared to bosses like Achilles and Avarok. On top of this, there's also conveniently located elite bellkeepers near every possible damage location. As a result, players can afford to get Lumina up on top of a Felwinter's finisher for a debuff, the most efficient stacking setup in the Season 21 meta. As for weapons and supers, we're dealing with 2 Warlocks and a Hunter when it comes to speedrunning, so 2 Broodweavers, a Golden Gun, and a ton of rockets probably make the most sense. Besides the fact that no one gets to rally before Kytl in a speedrun, everything else is pretty straightforward, and thankfully you need barely any rocket ammo to kill her. Spire of the Watcher. Next up we have Spire, not the raid, but the dungeon. There's not much in common between the 2 bosses, and the environment the dungeon takes place in doesn't really have any bearing on damage strat crafting, so let's dive right into the bosses themselves. Achilles. First up is Big Harpy number 2. Much like Consecrated, Achilles requires players to break 12 eyes in order to do damage, but with a catch. Achilles' eyes are yellow, have much less health, and are actually part of his damage phase timer. While competent teams will never have to worry about this timer when trying to kill the boss, it's still important to remember that breaking eyes quickly is a priority. Another similarity to its garden equivalent, Achilles continuously moves backward as soon as all of his eyes are broken, meaning that while slugs can be viable, the boss needs to be chased in order to stay within range. The same comments made about damage supers and Gjallarhorn apply to this boss, meaning that the best supers are still Marksman Golden Gun and Curious Thundercrash. Weapon-wise, we're still talking Lumina and Radiant plus a double slug tracker user, with the 3rd player on Izzy's Sniper or double slug rocket. As for the eyes, players usually break them with traces and then swap the slugs before damage. You know, come to think of it, Achilles is literally exactly the same as Consecrated when it comes to damage strategy, so just follow along with the other tips from that section, including things like Radiant Refreshing mid-phase. Percy's. Percy's used to be a little unique before Season of the Deep because it had damage resistance to weapons but not ability damage, which gave a rather sizable damage bonus to players standing inside their own well. This is because Well of Radiance converts the caster's weapon damage into super damage if they are standing within its radius. However, Bungie recently addressed this by removing this damage resistance entirely, meaning that having additional wells to boost weapon damage is no longer a useful strategy. Nowadays, Percy's is just a big wyvern that gets a little too close for comfort if you take too long to kill him. Since Percy's doesn't have an easy crit spot to hit being a wyvern, players will usually opt for weapons like grenade launchers, traces, witherhoard, and even fusion rifles to proc bait and switch on this boss. In an optimized speedrun, the best strat would be running a Lumina Witherhoard Gjallarhorn split with a Blade Barrage, a Mobius Quiver, and either a Needlestorm or another Blade, since Spire runs are either done on 3 Hunters or a 2 Hunter 1 Warlock split at the moment. Ghosts of the Deep. The most recently released content in this video is the Season of the Deep dungeon, which features Lucent Hive bosses for the first time in a raid or dungeon. That's right, Lucent Hive. That means Harmonic Resonance finally has a place where its damage buff might be useful, right? Well, unfortunately, Root of Nightmares didn't come with a rocket, so this little quirk doesn't actually mean much in full fireteam scenarios. Besides species, there is also the fact that both these bosses require a rather beefy shield around them to be broken before damage to their actual health bar can start. As a result, it's common practice to have a dedicated Arbalest player on the team to break the shield in a single shot so that damage can start instantly. Ekthar. Ekthar is a bit like Galron. He's a melee boss that can be a little annoying, especially if he suppresses you at the wrong time, but he's a lot less aggressive than Galron. If you shoot him rapidly enough, as long as you don't take too long to kill him, he tends to stay staggered without roaming too much. Besides putting up a shield or two, Ekthar doesn't pose too much of a challenge when it comes to damage with his massive knight head and large hitbox. While Ekthar is easily the highest effective health dungeon boss Bungie has ever released, he's actually not too hard to kill. A well is probably a good idea given how much damage his shield bros can do, and a Mobius Quiver is a suitable choice for a debuff even given the length of the phase, which leaves a spot for 1 damage super. Given how new this dungeon is, speedrunning strategies for damage haven't been fully optimized, but given the class composition at this encounter, 2 Hunters and 1 Warlock, it makes the most sense to have a Blade Barrage Gjallarhorn, a Needlestorm Lumina rocket, and a Mobius Quiver Arbalest rocket. Simuma. Unlike the vast majority of the dungeon bosses in the game, Simuma is actually quite annoying to pin down as a result of her erratic movement, long engagement range, and frequent teleporting. However, by using a deadfall tether on her as damage starts, she seems to stay in one place, which allows for a much more controlled kill. Given the distance as well as the factors mentioned, the damage strategy against Simuma needs to make a few modifications from the Ekthar loadouts. First, it's probably better that the Blade Barrage is replaced by a Nighthawk RDM swap Golden Gun. Second, the Mobius Quiver should be swapped with a Deadfall Tether to stop the boss from teleporting. Finally, any slug shotguns should be replaced by either a rapid-fire sniper or grenade launcher. After the release of the last video, a lot of you were asking for specific strategies for the various raid and dungeon bosses in Destiny 2, so I hope this video delivered exactly that. Taking the formula of environmental considerations plus a menu of effective damage rotations and plugging in every team DPS relevant boss in the game was the goal of this video, especially in the context of a full activity completion down to even speedrunning considerations. Here I plan on making an optimized boss baked video that doesn't consider activity context for entertainment value. For example, Kalli dies almost instantly with 6 golden guns in the encounter, but obviously that's not what you're going to run into with most teams doing Last Wish. Next video, I'm going to go over all the unique quirks that I've discovered during my time damage testing for this series, as well as explain every aspect of my spreadsheet since a lot of people have been asking how to interpret my data. After that, I might make one last video summarizing the most important bits from this series for more casual players who want a one and done sort of deal, instead of having to sift through 2 hours of material, and then we're on to greener pastures.